Liza Bernard from the Norwich Bookstore, but obviously hosting this event from home. And while the bookstore remains closed for browsing for safety reasons, we are definitely open for orders and talking about books on the phone and by email. And people are picking up their purchases from the porch, or we ship them anywhere in the country. We are working on plans to reopen by appointment. They're not finalized. We don't have a date, but stay tuned. It will happen. And for tonight's event, keep your audio off and your video off and your audio mute, please. And visually, when there's one speaker, it's helpful if you select the speaker option and then that presenter is front and center. Or if when there's two speakers, if you do gallery, then you'll see both speakers at the same time. It's your option, you control it on your screen. But then we encourage you to turn on the chat option, which is down at the bottom. And there you'll find links to the books, and there you also can add your questions and comments, which will become part of the conversation. We will be recording this event, and it'll be posted on our website later for any friends that may have missed it. So the format is brief introduction, and then Margot Livesey will have the floor to talk about her new book, The Boy in the Field. Very exciting. And she will be joined by Susan Brison, who will share the questions and comments that you post in the chat box, as well as talk with Margot about the writing in her books. And I want to give thanks to Michael Piles, whose name you've seen coming in and out, our virtual assistant, for helping have the event run smoothly. Okay, tonight. So Margot Livesey was last in Norwich 8 years ago when she spoke about The Flight of Gemma Hardy, which was a staff favorite. And we are pleased to have her back, albeit virtually. Margot grew up in a boys' private school in the Scottish Highlands where her father taught and her mother was a school nurse. She earned her BA in English and philosophy at the University of York in England. Margot has taught many, many readers and writers at Boston University, Bowdoin College, Tufts, University of California, to name just a few. She's also been the recipient of numerous fellowships, and there are way too many to list tonight. Currently, she teaches at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. She lives with her husband, a painter, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her first book, published in 1986, was a collection of stories. This was followed by 8 highly acclaimed novels, including Eva Moves the Furniture, The House on Fortune Street, and Banishing Verona. And she has a book of essays under her belt. Her 9th book, The Boy in the Field, was reviewed in the New York Times last week and was deemed, and I love this word, exquisite. It works. It is a quietly powerful novel of family and trauma. I'm going to quote from that review because I thought it described the book beautifully. Quote, Livesey's writing is quiet, observant, and beautifully efficient. There's not an extra word or scene in the book, and yet simultaneously so cinematic, you hear the orchestral soundtrack as you tear through the pages, end quote. So Margot will be joined in conversation tonight by Susan Brison, who is the, I'm going to get this right because I wrote it down, the Eunice and Julian Cohen Professor for the Study of Ethics and Human Values at Dartmouth College, where she also teaches in the program in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Susan has taught at several prestigious institutions of higher learning, and her articles have been published widely in anthologies and journals. Her book, Aftermath, Violence and the Remaking of a Self, was published by Princeton University Press. Without further ado, I turn the evening over to you two.
Thank you, Liza, and thank you, Michael, for making this possible and for hosting me at the wonderful Norwich Bookstore once again. And like many people, I've been getting through the pandemic by reading, and I'm just so grateful to bookshops for making that possible. And it's I cannot begin to describe how completely thrilling it is to be doing this event with Susan Brison. Susan is, I think, my oldest friend in North America. And if you look to the right of her bookshelves, you see the first book I published, a paperback. And I knew her before I published that book. And she has been completely instrumental in my life as a person, as a writer. She reads everything I write and I think everything I write, and makes invaluable comments. And The Boy in the Field owes a particular debt to her wonderful book, Aftermath, which describes in beautiful and sophisticated ways how a life can be broken and put back together, and the effects of trauma. And I just cannot thank you enough for doing this, Susan. And I'm going to begin by just give a very brief reading from the opening of the novel. It's set outside of Oxford, England, and I hope this isn't too hard to follow. The Field. Here is what happened one Monday in the month of September in the last year of the last century. Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan Lang were on their way home from school. Usually they took the bus from the larger town where they attended secondary school to the smaller town where they lived. But that morning their father had said he had an errand to run and would collect them. So they waited beside the school gates and watched the bus depart. After 15 minutes, with no sign of the familiar car, they began to walk along the road that led to their town. They each wore a version of the school uniform, a white shirt, black trousers, and a black pullover. Expecting their father to appear at any moment, they walked fast, making it a game to see how far they could get before he pulled up beside them. They left the last houses behind. Hawthorn hedges and an occasional ash tree hid the fields that bordered the road. Through one gate, they saw a herd of cows, through another, rows of barley. The afternoon was warm and still. Only a few leaves fringed with brown hinted at autumn. Gnats hung in listless clouds above the tarmac. Zoe was the one who spotted something through the hedge. She had a gift for finding things, birds' nests, their mother's calculator, a missing book, a secret. "What's that?" she demanded, stooping to peer through the tangled branches. The flash of red could have been poppies bordering the field, but the poppies had already lost their petals. Before her brothers could answer, she turned and ran back to the gate they had just passed. Matthew and Duncan watched her go. Zoe brought her knees high and pumped her arms. Last sports day, she had won the quarter mile by almost 3 seconds. As she reached the gate, Duncan, without a word, took off after her. A car sped by, the smooth engine noise undercut by a harsh rattle. Matthew looked at the sky, mostly blue with a fortress of cumulus clouds in the east, and gave up on being the responsible one who waited for their father. The 2 bags, his and Zoe's, banged against the metal bars of the gate as he climbed over and jumped onto the rutted ground. The field had recently been harvested, and circular bales of straw lay randomly across the dull gold stubble. In the middle of the field stood a magnificent oak tree in full leaf. Matthew caught up with first Duncan, then Zoe. From a distance, it was still possible to believe that the boy was asleep, lying on the grassy border between hedge and stubble. "Christ," whispered Zoe.
Wow. That was so beautiful. I just muted myself because coincidentally, our neighbor here in Thetford, Vermont is mowing his field. So I hope that the noise isn't too obtrusive, but I am just so thrilled to be here and to have this chance to talk with Margot about this exquisite book. And I just want to say a few things about when I met Margot, which was more years ago than I'm going to say, but this was in Toronto, and I was a rather ambivalent graduate student in philosophy, and Margot Livesey
I'm having trouble hearing Susan.
Really? Oh, okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Ah,
Uh-oh.
sorry. I can't see anything now, but I will keep speaking.
We can hear you.
Okay, the host stopped my video, so I'm starting it again here. Let's see. So, okay, sorry, never mind. Um,
Sorry, I interrupted. You were talking about your...
right, no, it's just that I was ambivalent as a graduate student in philosophy, and Margot was so unambivalently a writer that, you know, she knew just what she wanted to do and wanted to be, and I envied her sense of who she was and what she wanted to do with her life. And however she made her living at that time, whether it was selling flowers or waiting tables or starting a sandwich shop, or her life has been, as far as I've known her, wholly in writing, and has taught me so much about writing and about living, and has for all that time been just the perfect writing companion. I too love that New York Times book review, calling this novel exquisite and saying the writing is quiet, observant, and beautifully efficient. Although I realized I wouldn't use those precise words to describe Margot's writing in this novel. I mean, I'd say Margot's writing is poetic. I mean, in the sense that there's not an extra word. Every word counts, but also in the sense conveyed by Archibald MacLeish in Ars Poetica when he wrote, "A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds," or more famously, "A poem should not mean but be." The writing is so vivid, it does come to life. And one of the characters, Duncan, who you were introduced to in that first chapter, has an amazingly vivid pictorial imagination. So I wanted to just start off by asking you, Margot, what other art forms influenced you in writing this novel? And
Thank you for those beautiful, eloquent words. When I was 18, I spent 3 weeks at the Edinburgh Festival working at an exhibition called Strategy Get Arts. It was a palindrome, those words were a palindrome, which was an exhibition of artists around Joseph Beuys from Dusseldorf. And I was completely blown away by these very intense people. Joseph Beuys himself had a happening that he did every day, which lasted for 8 hours, which was just monumentally boring in the most fascinating way. And looking at pictures and looking at art has always been something that accompanied me from before that time, but even more so since that time. And I think in terms of other art forms, that poetry is something that, like many people, I turn to, marveling at how much can be done in a few lines, in a few words.
No, I was also struck in this novel by what you say very philosophically about how perception, visual perception, auditory perception, all kinds of sensory perception influences language. And conversely, how the languages that we speak influence what we see. And in the very first chapter, it's a little bit later, but in the chapter from which Margot just read, we learn that the boy in the field softly uttered one word, and that each of the children heard it differently. I'm not giving anything away. This is all right in the first chapter. So Matthew, the eldest, heard the boy in the field say, "Coward." Zoe, the middle child, heard cowrie, the name of the little shells she'd collected on the beach in Wales. And Duncan, the youngest heard cowslip, which for those of you not up on the names of British primroses is the name of a flower. And one of the many, many things I love about your writing, Margot, is it reveals this interplay between perceptions and memories. Um, and in this novel, at one point, Zoe gives an illustration of this by describing how her mother, who's a solicitor, is always talking about how easy it is to manipulate witnesses. So Zoe says, if you ask how fast the car was going when it hit the wall, people say 20 miles an hour. If you ask how fast it was going when it smashed the wall, they say 45. You know, but you also write in that first chapter about how what one perceives, that is what is most salient in one's sensory world, affects what one hears, like what words one uses to describe things. And I'm wondering, do you want to just say more about your thoughts about what I find a very deeply philosophical and fascinating question about the interplay between images and words and sensory perceptions and language, and how that works its way into this novel?
And I should say that Liza has said we will end at 8 p.m. So please know that I won't be trying to answer every facet of that wonderful question.
But I will restrain myself going forth.
But I think one thing, living mostly in a country far from the place where I grew up, living mostly as an expatriate, it makes me particularly dependent on memory. I mean, I would rephrase Descartes to say, not I think, therefore I am, but I remember, therefore I am. And yet I would also add that memory takes different forms. There's a kind of, the memory we can articulate, but there's also more embodied memories, if you will. And all of that really, really fascinates me, and of course comes with a certain amount of anxiety about how words are always shaping how we carry things in our minds, and how hard it is for most people to carry things just as images, or just as music, or as olfactory memories. So I think that I'm, in some way or other, I always come back to this fascination of what would I be without my memory? And at the same time, you know, if I tell you that I won the egg and spoon race when I was 8, no one is going to say, no, 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 you came third equal or something. I mean, I have a lot of scope to be a liar in my memories. And I often wish that weren't so.
So I also like how in this novel, as in many of your novels, you talk about the hazards of moral life. Your comment about lying just now reminded me that in this novel, you really talk about the double binds that we're often faced with, even when we're trying to be as good as possible. We're trying to live an ethical life with integrity. And you give some examples of when lying can actually be the morally right thing to do. And alternatively, there are times when truth-telling can be wrong. And I wonder if you'd like to say more about that in the context of The Boy in the Field.
In the context of my life, I grew up with a powerful Sunday teacher, Mr. Chisholm, telling the Sunday school that a lie was a terrible thing and would inevitably be found out. And as an adult, I've been perplexed to discover that that is not invariably the case. It's been very distressing to me. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to write about 3 younger characters is because I think younger people often have a more powerful sense of morality and integrity, and that as adults we get worn down into compromise. So at certain points when I was writing the novel, people would say, I would tell them a little about it, and they'd say, "Oh, are you writing a young adult novel?" And I'd say, "No, no, no. It's an adult novel. It's a normal novel. My characters just happen to be younger, but I like the fact that they can have the kind of moral complexity that sometimes older characters lack."
Mm, mm. Now, for those of you who haven't read this yet, after the first chapter, the rest, right up to the last two chapters, alternate among the three children, and their titles are after the children: Matthew, Duncan, Zoe. Matthew, Duncan, Zoe. I forget whether they're always in that order or not. They're not. Okay. Such a careless reader am I. And although each of these chapters is written from the very distinctive perspective of one of the children, they're all written in the third person. And I'm wondering if you could say something more about why you chose that particular narrative form for this novel.
I grew up reading a lot of 19th century novels, and in the 19th century novel, the omniscient voice is often the telling voice, the voice of the story. And I did have some thoughts that maybe I could make that work for The Boy in the Field, but I also wanted to capture the way in which I feel each member of a family is having a different experience, as you were just talking about with language and perception. And each member of a family is part of this tribe and also trying to get free of the tribe. Perhaps particularly Zoe is trying to step into her own life, not to be a daughter, not to be a sister. Duncan, the youngest, who's adopted and who starts looking for his birth mother, is very unambivalent about his family, his adopted family. He loves them. He has no thought of leaving them. He would just like to know this other person who played a role in his life. And Matthew, I think, doesn't think so much about the family. He's become a kind of quasi-detective looking for the boy's assailant and trying to solve the problem of evil, trying to make the world make sense again.
No, you deal beautifully with the problem of evil, and as you mentioned, I've written about trauma from a first-person point of view, but I think one of the remarkable things about this book is that it goes very deeply into what Tom, my husband, and I imagine others call secondary trauma. I mean, the trauma that's experienced by those who witness someone else's death or near fatal stabbing, as in this case. And yeah, I'm just wondering if you have more to say about influences on your thinking about how trauma changes people. I mean, you illustrate that so beautifully in describing the life trajectories of the various characters in the novel. But just be curious to know what more you have to say about this.
Well, I think one of the things I wanted to do, and this is a somewhat indirect answer to your question, was to write a novel that in a certain way paid homage to the form of a detective novel. I mean, it begins like many detective novels with the finding of a body. And I think one of the reasons people love detective novels is both because they feel carried along as readers and because the pact, the bargain of a detective novel is that the crime will be solved. The world will make sense again. And that really interests me. So I was sort of thinking about a novel in which underneath there's a kind of detective story of a more traditional form, but the real preoccupation of the novel is with the inner lives of the three teenagers, and that finding the boy, it sort of makes their lives jump the tracks, if you will. It sets each of them off in another direction. So it seems at first like the boy in the field is like a stone, if you will, thrown into one of the windows of the family house, but that's not actually how it turns out. It's more like they each head towards a different point of the compass, searching for something that they need to become whole again.
Right. Oh, now I love how Duncan, the adopted child, reveals to his adoptive mother, who is his mother, the only mother he's known and whom he adores completely, that he suddenly has this desire to find his birth mother. And his mother says, well, why? Why now? Why? Did something happen? And he thinks to himself, well, of course, I just found this boy who was almost dead, stabbed, lying in a field. And of course, my life has changed and I need to know new things now.
Yeah.
I'm really struck by that.
Yes, and I wanted Duncan's, his quest to be in a way, it's not meant to be a sort of vexed quest in a way. I mean, I think he would be very disappointed if someone stopped him trying to find his birth mother, but he is doing it without wanting to disturb the family. He doesn't like having to cause pain to his family.
Oh. We've got a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to turn to them in 1 minute, but I want to say one more thing or ask you maybe to read a very brief passage about what People magazine calls the almost magically good dog. I mean, there's another character who is a very main character in this novel, and that's Lily. And Lily has a very special relationship with Duncan. And that relationship also illustrates, I mean, to me, or illuminates for me, how so much can be expressed without language, and how some things have to be conveyed without being put into words. I'm not sure if you want to read a bit, and then we have questions from Gretchen, Leslie, and Emma.
I would love to read something. I will just say briefly that Lily was born at a private school in New York where I was visiting a number of classes, and the youngest children I met with were 10 years old, and they'd been reading my stories, and they were asking me questions. And a girl called Megan said, I like your stories, Margot, but I just don't understand why the animals don't talk. And so I asked them about their stories, and they all wrote stories. And of course, the animals in their stories talked. I mean, what was the point of an animal in a story if it wasn't going to chat? And I thought that was such a great question. It took me a long time to find my way to Lily. And in fact, I'm not actually going to read about her right now. I'm going to read about working up to finding Lily. So this is the red carpet being rolled out for Lily. During his brief period as a Boy Scout, Duncan had learned that the compass has 32 points. Now he could say with confidence that each member in his family was heading towards a different one. Matthew was spending hours with Rachel, who was pretty and principled, but not kind. Zoe was searching for something. She didn't seem to know what or whom. His father was nicer when he was around, but he was around less. His mother, between her cases and her ancient Greek, was always busy. Several afternoons a week, Duncan opened the front door and entered an empty house. By mid-October, he couldn't bear it. He found his father standing on a chair in the sitting room, putting up a new curtain rod. "We need a dog," Duncan said. "But after Arthur," his father moved the bracket to the left, "you said you never wanted another dog." "That was how I felt then. Now I feel differently." Duncan remembered every minute of the afternoon he had come home from school to find Arthur in his basket, refusing to go for a walk or even to eat. He'd sat beside him, stroking the smooth curve of his head until Arthur was sleeping soundly. His father had promised to take him to the vet in the morning if he wasn't better, but I bet he will be, he said. Duncan had gone to bed, reassured, and woken a few hours later in terror. In the kitchen, he had known at once that Arthur was gone. He spent the rest of the night sitting beside him, drawing picture after picture. The next morning, they had buried him under one of the laburnum trees. "Let me get these screws in," his father said. The drill whirred 3 times. He got down from the chair, moved it to the other side of the window, and climbed up again. "Should we look for a dachshund?" "No, that would make me miss Arthur even more." On Sunday, they drove to the animal rescue. Duncan had imagined it like an orphanage, barred windows, the dogs thin and miserable, the air rancid. But as soon as they came into the clean, bright room, he could tell the animals were well treated. Cats to the left, dogs to the right. Each was in its own pen behind a grill with a bed and toys and food and water. Each had a biography. Charlie Boy likes children over 5 and regular walks. Rita has retired from greyhound racing. She needs a large garden and a stable home. Max gets nervous if people stare at him, but is friendly. Almost all the dogs came over to smile at Duncan. Most of them stood on their hind legs. If only he could pat them, but every few yards there were signs about not touching. He walked around the U-shaped corridor, stopping at each pen and back again. He wanted the lurcher, he wanted the terrier, he wanted the spaniel and the beagle. It would be awful to choose one and leave the others behind.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for reading that. So I'm going to turn to questions that have come in. Gretchen writes, "I'm interested in your thoughts, Margot, about why the novel is set in 1999. I believe that the social media of 2020 would spoil, in some sense, the sensory and moral knowing of each child. Did you have specific reasons for 1999?
Partly exactly what you say, Gretchen, that social media, mobile phones would have complicated my plot in, I think, not very helpful ways. But it was also something to do with 1999 itself, with everyone worrying about Y2K and thinking that planes would fall from the skies and computers would crash. And we were anticipating danger, but we were looking in the wrong direction. And I think there was something very interesting about that moment. I also think that perhaps children, teenagers had more autonomy in 1999 than they do now, that it was easier for me to imagine my 3 characters leading independent lives and having their own projects. I think perhaps teenagers are more closely tied by the tether of the cell phone, as it were.
Mm. And also by, more protective parents, perhaps. There's a greater sense that children need to be kept close, to be, yes, spared things like seeing a boy who's been stabbed almost to death in a field. Leslie asks, "Thank you for talking to us about your book. You mentioned that you didn't write a book for teens, but about teens. Would it be inappropriate for a 14-year-old to read it?"
I think of my own life as a teenager as being one of passionate reading. And so, I would like to say that I think The Boy in the Field would be perfect for a 14-year-old. And a number of the children I interviewed or talked to or hung out with were passionate and sophisticated readers. So I had them very much in mind, both as subject and as audience.
Hmm. Emma writes, thank you, loving this. I'd love to know Margot, what your favorite mystery books are, or what writers you can't wait to read. There's multiple questions here. Do you have a favorite genre of book to read? And why? Thank you.
I will confess that I don't read that many mysteries. But as a teenager, as a child, I read Agatha Christie and Gail Marsh. Am I getting that right? And later Inspector Morse books and people like Rex Stout. And nowadays I read Tanya French and Kate Atkinson, Louise Walsh, Ian Rankin. You can see there's a slight bias towards the other side of the Atlantic. But I'm interested in the way, I think this has been a wonderful time for women detectives and women writers of detective fiction. There are many, many more examples than I'm naming, and I often envy these writers for the way they captivate the reader and make their characters so complicated and so interesting.
Mm. Mm. It's fascinating that I think in each of your novel, there is kind of a mystery that needs to be solved. I mean, in a broad sense, as I think the New York Times reviewer said, this novel is a whodunit. Yeah. But in a more interesting sense, it's not. I mean, I'm someone personally who's never really had that much interest in detective novels or crime novels, partly because traditionally they tend to begin with a beautiful blonde dead woman's body that somebody has to come up with some theory about, what happened to her, but there's no interest at all in the victim herself. So thank you for not beginning with a dead woman lying in a field. And a boy who actually, anyway, I won't give anything away, but at the time that he's seen, he is uttering inscrutable words. But I mean, the real mystery is what is going on in the minds of these characters? What are they going to discover about themselves? And that journey of self-discovery on the part of your characters is, for me, much more compelling and gripping than thinking, oh, well, who did the deed? I need to know. So Vicky has a question. I'm interested in your process, Margot. Where did this book start? With the characters, with plot, with an image, with an idea?
Yeah, and I always ask this question myself, the origin question, and I have some ways to answer it, but of course they don't fully explain where the novel came from. One part of it was that my mother, Eva, of Eva Moves the Furniture, died when I was 2.5, and my father died when I was 22. And at that point, I very explicitly thought, I have absolutely no relatives. There is not one person connected to me by DNA. And I went on believing that for 4 decades, more than 4 decades. And then a former student was doing research for me on ancestry.com into my family. And someone contacted her, and that person turned out to be, I used to know this, I think a second cousin once removed. I can never quite figure out how the cousin thing works. And it turned out to my amazement that I have lots of relatives. They happen to live in Australia. And I went to visit them like a water diviner, going from person to person saying, do I feel something for you? Is there something underneath this that makes me feel connected to you? Do we have anything in common? Does this matter? Is it interesting? I found the whole process, yeah, very, very striking. And I was already writing The Boy in the Field, but it deepened my feelings about Duncan's quest for his birth mother. And I also much earlier had re-encountered an old school friend who had someone again I hadn't seen in many years, who'd come home one afternoon and to this tiny village where no one locked their doors, and found the body of a young woman at the bottom of his garden. And it completely changed his life, not in obvious ways, but in much more profound ways. And nearly 40 years later, he told me a little bit about that, and it made a huge impression on me. So those two things were very much at the heart of the book. And the third thing is, I think, this whole idea of how we talk about making decisions or making choices as if it's a deliberate process, as if it's like making a fried egg sandwich with a number of stages. And in fact, so many things in my life have happened without my making a conscious decision or a conscious choice. Or if I did think I was making a choice, I didn't know what I was choosing. So those three things are all at the heart of The Boy in the Field. Along perhaps with Walter Mosley, author of Devil in Blue Dress and others,
Right.
mystery novels, saying to me, every novel should have a mystery, Margot.
And I have to qualify what I said before about not being interested in detective novels by saying, you introduced me to Walter Mosley, and I do love his writing.
Yeah.
But this question of choice recurs in the novel and fascinates me as a philosopher. You know, that we're not really in control of our destinies to the extent that we think that we are. But also you stress the importance of being receptive to whatever happens to one. I see this particularly in the experience of the character Duncan. I don't remember the exact passage, but there's one instance when he was being asked a question, and he has difficulties with language, verbal expression, although he's really a wonderful artist at a very early age. And you said at this point he just stopped trying. He stopped trying to be in control and just think, okay, what is the answer to this question? And just gave himself over. And the question occurred to him. And I really like that. I mean, I think there are moments in each of our lives when we think, oh, I need to be on this. I need to get this under my control. I need to figure out what I'm going to do next. And often that process is just hopeless. Whereas backing off and realizing, well, no, actually, I'm not in control, and who knows what's going to happen next can sometimes yield wonderful results.
Yes, I mean, I'm a little flustered by that. I think I aspire to that, but usually fail miserably.
And yeah, I also wondered if you could say more about Duncan. I don't mean to slight the other characters. they're equally fascinating, but I think it may be because I myself don't have that great a visual imagination or pictorial memory, that I'm just fascinated by the way that you describe how Duncan sees the world, including seeing things that most of us, at least people like me, would just never notice. And wonder if you could say something about the artists that influenced him and how they affected his life and his approach to his own art. I mean, he's just a child, but he really comes across in the novel as a very serious painter.
And yes, I think he is. Like many people, I had the good fortune to go to a wonderful exhibition of the work of the Italian painter, Giorgio Morandi, at the Metropolitan Museum. And it was a very small and intimate exhibition. And there was something very unusual in the quality of attention that people were giving the paintings and the way people were going back and forth between the paintings, most of which were quite small, maybe, I don't know, 20 by 14, 30 by 18. They were not big paintings, and they were all of a number of bottles or vases painted over and over again, until in the final paintings, the vases almost disappear. They've almost vanished. And then later, I bought a catalogue or a book about Morandi, and there was a wonderful essay by the Italian writer Umberto Eco. And he talked about how, as a teenager in an Italian town after the Second World War, he had never seen modern painting. And then there was suddenly an exhibit of contemporary painting. And in that small group of paintings was one by Morandi, and he describes going every day for 2 weeks to look at the painting before the exhibition closed. And I was very moved both by Morandi's work and by the way Umberto Eco and many other people describe their relationship to that work and that quality of attention, that quality of looking at things.
I'm just wondering if there are any other questions. I can see by looking at names that there are some wonderful writers in the room and friends. And I'm going to just pause a minute and see if anyone wants to pose a question. You would need to open chat at the bottom and just send something to everyone.
And I should have said at the beginning how very much I appreciate all of your coming. I know that the pandemic can be unexpectedly busy in ways that we still can't quite figure out. And I'm really grateful to you for spending this hour with Susan and Liza and me.
Oh, well, Liza has a question. Is there a next book in the works? I'm so glad you asked that, because I never ask that and I always want to know. So Margot, is there a next book in the works?
Ever since the pandemic sort of arrived on our doorsteps, I've been hard at work on a short novel. Its only virtue at the moment is probably that it enables me to go to Scotland every day. It's very Scottish in both its subject matter and its setting. Whether it will ever see the light of day, I remain quite uncertain. But yeah, I'm writing like an exile because I can't go there myself.
Well, we look forward to that. Leslie asks, Susan said you always knew that you were a writer. How early did you know you were a writer? And how did you get started? And how has your process changed over time? Now people are bursting with questions.
Well, as friends have heard me say, I actually had serial ambitions as a child. I wanted to be a veterinarian, and I wanted to be a nun because I read a book called The Nun's Story about a nun working in Africa, and she saves people and falls in love, and it's all deeply romantic. And I wanted to be Marie Curie. I spent my last year of high school trying to discover a new element in a way that drove my chemistry teacher mad. He was very unsympathetic to the project. So I would have to say I didn't try to write anything till I was 21. And I think until I was well into my 30s, the word writer seemed too masculine for me to use. It just conjured up, Hemingway-like people going around with guns and drinking too much. And it took me a long time to use the word about myself and to realize that there were people writing now who they were on the planet and they were writing wonderful books now, like at that time Doris Lessing, for instance, and Margaret Drabble were two early heroines.
Hmm. Oh, so Peter asks, no, points out, I loved the Jane Eyre novel. Maybe you can say something about the Jane Eyre novel and Mercury, all of them. They're all so different. Do you go through obsessions, phases that bring you to a subject?
And
Oh,
this,
it's actually Katie Crouch on Peter's account.
and Katie and Peter are both wonderful writers whom I hope to see next time I'm at the Norwich Bookstore, or perhaps even before then. I do go through something obsessions, and I also go through aesthetic ambitions. So an ambition for The Boy in the Field was to write a short novel in which a great deal happens. And I tried not to let the novel go above 200 pages. And partly I was influenced by such wonderful novels as James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room and Penelope Fitzgerald's The Coming of Spring. Novels so rich in plot and so profound in their depth, and yet not many pages. And I thought that was just wonderful. And I have central preoccupations, and so it seems even more important for me to try to find ways of dressing my preoccupations up in new clothes and trying new forms.
Oh, I do want to just tell people about The Flight of Gemma Hardy. That's what Katie was referring to.
Yeah, and which was born out of my almost lifelong relationship with Jane Eyre, a novel I read when I was the same age as Jane, and when the novel starts, and I just went on loving it.
Oh, and I see Michael has put the link to it in chat. One more question. Emma says, I'm curious to know what your identity as a Scot means to you. This is in the next 2 minutes.
And I'm off.
It means a great deal. So.
My identity as a Scottish person is complicated. I grew up in a school that was like a boys' boarding school that was like an outpost of the English Raj, and almost everyone I knew at the school was English and didn't want to be Scottish. Was cross when I came home saying, oh, hi, look at the coos in the field. And at school, I went to Morrison's Academy for Girls. That attitude was mirrored. We studied only English history. We studied, oddly, the only thing I can remember studying in geography is Norwegian fjords. We must have studied something else, but nothing to do with the British Isles. And we read, I think I can say no Scottish authors.
Really?
The nearest we came to a Scottish author was Macbeth. So I was very much turned in another direction. And it wasn't really until I was in my 20s that I began to understand that Scotland had its own culture, a very rich culture, that there were wonderful writers and philosophers and artists at work in Scotland, that we had our own embattled history, the history of a colonized country. And now I always think of myself as Scottish, and yes, I'm happy to be British, but I don't want to be just English if I have a choice.
Oh, wonderful. Liza.
Great. Well, this might be a good time to wrap it up. Did you have any last words, Susan, before we?
Margot?
Margot, that's the next question. Margot, do you have anything else that we didn't touch? We touched on a lot of things tonight. Do you have anything we didn't touch on that you want to share with the people here?
Well, just that there have been there are terrible hardships about the pandemic all around us. And those hardships have made me even more aware of how lucky I am to have this community of readers, people from very different backgrounds and cultures, and how we can share reading in this profound, almost magical way across time and distance and social distance and all the separations that are imposed on our lives at the moment. So it's made reading feel particularly precious to me.
Thank you. I can agree with that. I can agree with that. So we're going to wrap up tonight. Really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and your ideas and process. There are links to the books in the chat box, so you can just go to the website, or you can call us or email us. We're there. Currently, we're there Tuesday through Friday, and then Saturdays from 9 to 2. And I want to just remind you all to mark your calendars that we've got other events coming up. Gretchen Charrington's talking about her new memoir on the 9th, and there will be an evening of poetry with Cleopatra Mathis and Susan Barba on the 16th of September. And really appreciate you all joining us tonight. It was a good group. And Susan, thank you so much. Margot, thank you so much. This has been a very just exquisite evening, to use the word. So thank you all for coming, and join us again.
Thank you for making this possible.
Thank you, Liza, and thank you so much, Susan, for the wonderful, thoughtful questions. And thank you to everyone who listened and sent in questions. I'm deeply appreciative.
Great. So keep writing.
I will.
Good, good, good.